What's wrong, sweetheart? Break a nail during PT. The insult cut through the humid Virginia beach air like shrapnel. Lieutenant Bryn Callahan stood motionless in the pre-dawn fog that rolled across Naval Amphibious Base Coronado's obstacle course staging area, thick enough to muffle sound, but not thick enough to hide the tension crackling between the six figures assembled there. 5 Marines had formed a predatory circle around her, their boots crushing gravel with deliberate menace. Master Sergeant Garrett Thorne stood at the apex, all 6 foot 3 inches of him. 17 years of force recon experience radiating from every calculated movement. His smile carried the kind of cruelty that came from men who'd defined themselves entirely through physical dominance and were now watching a world that no longer exclusively validated that particular brand of strength. Behind him, his squad waited like backup dancers in a bad intimidation routine. Sergeants Wyatt Bishop and Cole Brennan, both combat veterans who'd learned their prejudices from men who'd learned theirs from other men stretching back through generations. Finn Merrick, quieter but complicit in his silence. And Corporal Tucker Hayes, youngest of the group at 24, eager to prove himself worthy of their respect by adopting their contempt. They'd been sent here for advanced tactical training, cross-service integration, meant to sharpen the blade of America's special operations community. But their real mission had crystallized the moment they'd seen a woman's name on the instructor roster. Not just any woman, a lieutenant, 28 years old, teaching them about warfare. Bryn maintained her parade rest position with the stillness of a loaded weapon. Her dark hair regulation tight in a bun that had survived a 5-mile ocean swim 2 hours earlier dripped salt water onto shoulders that carried invisible weight. At 5'6" and 130 pounds, she didn't look like much. That was always the first mistake people made. While the Marines around her broadcasted their strength through bulk and bravado, Bryn's power lived in negative space. In the way she distributed her weight evenly across both feet, ready to explode into motion without telegraphing intent. In how her breathing remained controlled despite the adrenaline flooding the morning air. In the micro adjustments of her stance that kept every major muscle group coiled prepared. Her fingers found the edge of her tactical glove, unconsciously tracing the ridge of scar tissue that ran from her palm to her wrist. That scar had a name, Lieutenant Michael Donovan. But these Marines didn't know about Donovan. They didn't know about Kandahar. They didn't know that the woman they were circling had been someone else entirely before she'd become an instructor. They were about to receive an education that no military academy could provide. Colonel Marcus Whitaker watched from the tower overlooking the course, his weathered face revealing nothing. At 58, he'd seen enough warriors to recognize one regardless of packaging. He knew exactly who Bryn Callahan was, what she'd done in places that didn't exist for missions that never happened. He also knew she'd specifically requested this assignment, had practically demanded it. The question that kept him awake was why someone with her operational history would volunteer to teach basic selection candidates who despised her on sight. Thorne stepped forward, cracking his knuckles with theatrical precision, the sound sharp in the fog. You know what I think, Lieutenant? I think someone pulled strings to get you here. I think you're proof that standards are sliding, that we're more worried about optics than operational effectiveness. Bishop and Brennan shifted their weight predatory. Merrick's jaw tightened. Hayes smiled, young and stupid and cruel. Bryn's response was silence. Not the silence of intimidation, but the silence of someone calculating angles, assessing threats, deciding whether these men were worth the effort of words. Her hands stayed at her sides, but her left hand trembled slightly. Not from fear, from nerve damage that would never fully heal. That tremor told a story these Marines couldn't read. It spoke of 17 minutes holding pressure on a chest wound while her own hand was nearly severed. It spoke of Afghan dirt and helicopter blood and promises made to dying men. It spoke of a woman who'd flatlined twice in service to her nation and had been brought back both times. Thorne mistook her silence for weakness. Nothing to say. That's what I thought. Why don't you run along and let the adults handle today's training? We'll tell your commander you tried your best. The dragon balance tattoo hidden beneath Bryn's collar seemed to burn against her skin. Those coordinates, inked in black and wrapped in the image of a dragon coiled around a balance scale, marked a graveyard in Afghanistan, where she'd buried 8 men after a mission that never officially existed. Where she'd learned the price of service, the cost of promises kept to the dead. Before she could respond, before this confrontation could escalate into something Colonel Whitaker would have to officially acknowledge, the moment shattered. for now. But Thorne's words hung in the air like smoke from a weapons discharge, and everyone present knew this was just the beginning. The story of how Bryn Callahan came to stand in that circle began not on the obstacle course at Coronado, but in blood and fire halfway across the world. It began with a man who'd been more than her commanding officer, more than her mentor. It began with Captain James Donovan and a convoy moving through Kandahar province on a mission so classified that even its failure was considered need to know. Kandahar province, Afghanistan, April 2020, Operation Copper Shield. The convoy consisted of two vehicles, both disguised as civilian transport, moving through Taliban-controlled valleys under a moonless sky. Bryn had been listed officially as intelligence support, a convenient fiction that allowed her to operate with SEAL Team 4 despite the official prohibitions that still existed. She'd passed Green Team selection 18 months earlier, graduating top of her class, but her name would never appear on any roster. The Pentagon wasn't ready to acknowledge what she represented. What mattered in the darkness of Afghan night wasn't official titles or political calculations. What mattered was whether you could carry your weight plus 30% more when someone went down. What mattered was whether your teammates trusted you with their lives. Bryn had earned that trust in blood. She rode in the second vehicle 50 meters behind the lead truck, where Captain James Donovan commanded. At 32, Donovan was old for special operations, a career SEAL who'd turned down promotions to stay operational. He believed in leading from the front and never asking his people to take risks he wouldn't take himself. That belief would kill him. The IED detonated at exactly 0247 hours. The explosion was massive, powerful enough to flip the lead vehicle, completely sending it tumbling through the air before it crashed upside down in a drainage ditch. The sound was apocalyptic, a thunderclap that turned the peaceful night into instant chaos. Bryn's vehicle slammed to a halt. The driver screamed into the radio, calling for immediate support, but Bryn was already moving. She'd unstrapped, grabbed her M4, and was out the door before the echoes of the explosion had faded. Behind her, she heard her teammates shouting, trying to establish a perimeter, trying to understand what had just happened. She understood perfectly. They'd driven into an ambush. Classic Taliban tactics. The IED was just the opening move. The real killing would come from the high ground surrounding them, from fighters who'd spent months planning this exact moment. The first RPG round hit 15 seconds after the IED. It screamed past Bryn's head close enough that she felt the heat close enough to smell the propellant. It detonated against a rock formation to her left, showering her with stone fragments. Then the automatic weapons fire began pouring down from 3 directions simultaneously. In the academy, they teach you about the fog of war, about how chaos and confusion turn trained soldiers into panicked animals. They don't teach you about the clarity that comes when you accept you're already dead, when you stop worrying about survival and focus entirely on mission completion. Bryn moved through the kill zone like water finding the path of least resistance. Her M4 spoke in controlled pairs, the rhythm steady and professional. She'd trained for this moment since she was 18, had refined her skills through countless iterations of room clearing and close quarters combat. But training under California sunshine was nothing compared to this. The Taliban fighters had expected panic. They'd expected the Americans to seek cover, to call for air support, to huddle behind their vehicles until rescue arrived. What they found instead was a small figure advancing toward them through their own fire, selecting targets with mechanical precision. Bryn took down the first fighter at 40 meters, double tap to center mass. The second at 35 meters, catching him as he adjusted position. She didn't think about the men she was killing, didn't process them as human beings with families and histories. In combat, hesitation is death. Mercy is suicide. You become a weapon yourself, and weapons don't feel. She reached the overturned lead vehicle as the third RPG screamed overhead. This one found its mark, slamming into the vehicle's undercarriage with a force that lifted it several feet off the ground before it crashed back down. The explosion threw Bryn forward, and she landed hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. But she was up in seconds, driven by something more powerful than fear or pain. Through the smoke and fire, she could see movement inside the vehicle. Someone was still alive. She reached through the shattered window and found Donovan's body wedged against the crumpled doorframe. His eyes were open, conscious, and in them, she saw recognition. He tried to speak, but blood filled his mouth. His chest was a mess of shrapnel and torn flesh, the kind of wound that meant death was a question of minutes, not hours. Bryn pressed her left hand against the largest wound, trying to maintain pressure despite the awkward angle. She called into her radio reporting casualties, requesting immediate QRF quick reaction force, providing coordinates. Her voice was steady, professional, betraying none of the terror coursing through her veins. Donovan's hand found hers where it pressed against his chest. His grip was weak but deliberate. He was trying to tell her something, trying to communicate something vital with the last moments of his life. That's when the vehicle's door, already weakened by the explosion, came loose from its remaining hinge. It fell like a guillotine, 300 pounds of armored steel dropping straight down on Bryn's extended left arm. The pain was instantaneous and totalizing. The door's edge caught her hand at the wrist, crushing down with enough force to shatter bone and sever tissue. She felt tendons snap, felt the ridge of her hand give way under impossible pressure. Blood poured from the wound, her blood mixing with Donovan's in the Afghan dirt. But she didn't pull away. Couldn't pull away. Removing her hand from Donovan's chest would mean his death in seconds. So she held pressure with a hand that was barely attached, held pressure while her own world narrowed to a tunnel of agony and determination. 17 minutes. That's how long Bryn maintained pressure on Donovan's chest wound, while her left hand was pinned and mangled beneath the vehicle door. 17 minutes of talking him through shock, of promising him rescue, was coming, of lying about his chances while her own body screamed. 17 minutes of counting his heartbeats, of feeling his life pump through her fingers with each progressively weaker contraction. She talked to keep him conscious, talked about his daughter Emma, 6 years old, who played soccer on weekends, talked about the beach house he wanted to buy in California when he retired, talked about anything except the truth, which was that they were both dying in a ditch in Afghanistan and rescue might not arrive in time. The QRF found them at minute 17. They found Bryn still covering Donovan's body, with her own still maintaining pressure despite the hand that hung from her wrist by threads of tissue. They had to physically pull her away, had to pry her mangled fingers from his chest. Donovan survived the helicopter flight, survived long enough to reach the field hospital, survived long enough to be conscious for his final 2 hours, his eyes locked on Bryn's face while medics worked frantically to save him. His last words, whispered through blood and morphine, became her compass. Make them better than us. Tell Emma her dad wasn't just a warrior. Then he was gone. Bryn flatlined 43 seconds later. The shrapnel she'd ignored while focused on Donovan had done more damage than anyone realized. Her heart stopped, and for those 43 seconds, she was clinically dead. They brought her back. She flatlined again during surgery, her body finally giving up after blood loss and trauma pushed her past the edge. 2 minutes that time. 2 minutes of darkness before they shocked her heart back into rhythm. When she woke, her left hand was rebuilt with pins and grafts. The surgeon said she'd never have full feeling again. That nerve damage was permanent. Half her palm would be numb forever. The tremor under stress would never completely fade. They presented this as tragedy, as career-ending injury. Bryn saw it as reminder. Every tremor would be Donovan's heartbeat against her palm. Every numb sensation would be 17 minutes of holding on. Every scar would be a promise kept to a dying man who'd asked her to make the next generation better. The Dragon Balance tattoo came during recovery leave in Thailand, 6 months after Kandahar. The coordinates marked the exact GPS location where Donovan had died. The dragon represented strength. The balance scale represented justice. Together they meant that power without purpose was meaningless, that strength must be governed by wisdom. Bryn's decision to transition to instruction wasn't about following in anyone's footsteps. It was about honoring a promise to a man who'd believed in her when official policy said she shouldn't exist. It was about taking everything she'd learned in 16 classified operations across 6 countries and using it to prepare others for the reality of modern warfare. To understand why Bryn Callahan became the warrior who stood in that circle at Coronado, you had to understand where she came from. You had to understand Master Chief Clayton Callahan, her father, a man whose shadow she'd grown up in, but whose path she'd never tried to follow. Berlin, 1980. The Cold War burned at its coldest, and the wall that divided the city stood as monument to ideological hatred. Clayton Callahan was 27 years old, a Navy corpsman attached to a Marine recon unit conducting operations that existed in the gray zone between peacetime and war. The mission was simple in concept, impossible in execution. Extract a Soviet scientist who wanted to defect a man with knowledge of chemical weapons programs that NATO desperately needed. The extraction point was in East Germany, close enough to the border to make escape theoretically possible, far enough to make it practically suicidal. Clayton's team, 12 men total, including a young Marine lieutenant named Marcus Whitaker, moved through the darkness with professional precision. They were ghost-trained to operate in hostile territory without leaving evidence of American involvement. If they were caught, they'd be disavowed. If they died, their families would be told they died in training accidents. The extraction went wrong from the start. The scientists panicked, alerted a guard. Gunfire erupted. In the chaos, Soviet forces deployed chemical weapons, filling the night with nerve agent designed to kill in seconds. Clayton's training took over. He drilled for this scenario hundreds of times, had memorized the protocols for operating in MOP gear at level 4, the highest level of chemical protection. But knowing the theory and executing under fire were different universes. He got his team into protective equipment while rounds snapped overhead. Got them breathing filtered air while Soviet soldiers advanced. Got the scientists secured and moving toward the extraction point while his own body screamed for him to run, to save himself, to abandon these men to their fate. But Clayton Callahan didn't run. He moved through his team like a guardian angel, checking SEALs, monitoring symptoms, treating exposure when his Marines were too panicked to help themselves. His hands stayed steady, his voice stayed calm. His presence became the anchor that held the 12 terrified men together. Young Lieutenant Whitaker took shrapnel to the leg during the firefight. Clayton performed field surgery under chemical weapons, thread-extracting metal fragments by flashlight, while wearing gloves thick enough to rob him of sensation. The surgery was crude but effective. Whitaker would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but he would walk. All 12 men made it to the extraction point. All 12 men went home. The scientists defected successfully, providing intelligence that would prove crucial in the final years of the Cold War. The mission was classified at the highest levels and remained classified to this day. But Clayton's lesson stayed with him forever. Medicine isn't about strength. It's about steady hands and clear mind under fire. It's about being the person others can depend on when the world is ending around them. He carried that lesson through Desert Storm 6 years later, treating casualties from Scud missile attacks while wearing the same MOP gear, running the same protocols, demonstrating the same unshakable calm. By then he had a daughter, Bryn, 6 years old, who watched him pack his gear and wondered why her father was different from other fathers. Clayton tried to shield her from the truth of his service, tried to give her a normal childhood free from the weight of warfare. But children notice things. They notice when their father wakes screaming in the night. They notice when certain dates make him quiet and distant. They notice the scars that he claims came from accidents. By age 12, Bryn had decided she needed to understand. She asked Clayton to teach her to disassemble an M4, and he did, showing her each component with the patience of a man who understood that knowledge was power. She asked about tactics, about combat medicine, about what it meant to be a warrior. And slowly, carefully, he taught her. Not because he wanted her to follow his path. He'd hoped she'd choose something safer, something that wouldn't leave scars on her soul. But he recognized in his daughter the same drive that had powered him through Berlin and Kuwait. The drive to serve, to protect, to be worthy of the uniform. When Bryn enlisted in 2015 at age 18, Clayton knew better than to try stopping her. Instead, he gave her the only gift that mattered, the truth. He told her about the cost of service, about the promises you make to dead friends, about the weight of responsibility that never lifts. He told her that wars change, but principles don't, that technology evolves, but courage remains constant. What he didn't tell her, couldn't tell her, was that she would surpass him, that she would face trials that would make his Cold War experiences seem gentle by comparison, that she would become something the military hadn't quite figured out, how to classify a warrior who existed in the gray zones of official policy and operational necessity. By the time Bryn stood in that circle at Coronado, Clayton Callahan was 67 years old, retired, living quietly in San Diego. He knew she'd requested this assignment, knew she was deliberately putting herself in situations where she'd face the worst kind of prejudice and hostility. He tried talking her out of it during one of their regular phone calls. Her answer had been simple. Someone has to teach them, Dad. Better me than someone who'll break under their resistance. Clayton had recognized the echo of his own words from 30 years earlier. Principles don't change. The mission continues. Standards must be maintained not through exclusion, but through elevation. He'd taught her that. Now she would teach it others. The first week at Coronado confirmed Bryn's suspicions that Thorne and his team had come specifically to challenge her authority. Colonel Whitaker's warning during her arrival briefing had been diplomatic but clear. These Marines weren't here to learn. They were here to prove a point. Day one began in the briefing room with Bryn presenting her carefully prepared tactical brief on urban warfare transitions in maritime environments. Complex subject matter that required attention and professional respect. She outlined the unique challenges of building clearing while dealing with tidal variations, saltwater's corrosive effect on equipment, the integration of amphibious insertion with close quarters combat. Thorne remained seated when she entered a calculated disrespect that every person in the room recognized. His squad followed his lead, their attention everywhere except on her presentation. They whispered, they checked phones, they radiated contempt. 15 minutes into her brief, Thorne interrupted. "Ma'am, with all due respect, maybe we should hear from someone who's actually been in combat." The room went silent except for muffled snickers from Hayes and Bishop. Bryn paused, set down her marker, and looked directly at Thorne. She could have mentioned her Bronze Star with Valor, could have referenced her Purple Hearts, could have brought up the Navy Cross recommendation that had been buried for operational security reasons. Instead, she simply said, "Your concern is noted, Master Sergeant. The evolution begins at 0500 tomorrow." She continued her brief as if nothing had happened, her voice steady, her presentation flawless. But everyone present understood that lines had been drawn. The psychological warfare intensified over the following days. Her equipment developed mysterious malfunctions. Radio frequencies overlapped during her demonstrations, filling the channels with static at critical moments. The Marines arrived late, left early, performed just poorly enough to suggest incompetent instruction rather than deliberate sabotage. Bryn documented everything, noted each incident in official reports to Whitaker, made no accusations, simply recorded facts. She knew what Thorne was doing, recognized it as a campaign designed to force her resignation or to provoke an unprofessional response. She gave him neither. Day 5 brought the confrontation that made conflict inevitable. Bryn had been demonstrating proper tourniquet application during a combat casualty drill, showing the precise technique required to stop arterial bleeding. The Marines had watched with barely concealed boredom, making no effort to engage. Then Thorne stood up, walked over, and simply took the training aid from her hands. "Like this," he said to his men, ignoring her completely. "You need upper body strength to properly secure the windlass. Something not everyone has." Hayes, eager to prove himself, added with a smile, "Maybe we should lower the standards. Make it fair." The word fair hung in the air like a challenge. Bryn had stood perfectly still for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to let the insult land. Long enough to make her silence menacing. Then she'd spoken, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from absolute certainty. "Master Sergeant Thorne, you're absolutely right about upper body strength being important. Tell me, what's the maximum effective range of an M4 carbine?" Thorne had smirked, confident. 550 meters for point targets, ma'am." "And at what distance do most urban combat engagements actually occur?" "Under 50 meters. So physical strength matters less than speed, accuracy, and tactical judgment at typical engagement ranges. Wouldn't you agree?" Thorne's jaw tightened. Before he could formulate a response, Bryn delivered the challenge that would define everything that followed. 0400 tomorrow, Master Sergeant. Full combat load. We'll settle the question of standards definitively. That night, alone in her quarters, Bryn sat with the single photograph she'd brought to Coronado. Her SEAL team from Kandahar, faces digitally obscured for operational security, except for one, Captain James Donovan, whose family had agreed to declassification after his death. His face smiled out from the photo, forever frozen at 32, forever unaware of how his death would shape the woman holding his challenge coin. Her left hand trembled as she held that coin, the nerve damage manifesting under stress. The tremor wasn't physical pain anymore. It was muscle memory of those 17 minutes of promises made in blood of a dying man, asking her to make the next generation better than his own. She needed to call her father. needed to hear the voice that had guided her through every crisis in her life. Clayton Callahan answered on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep but instantly alert. 67 years old, and he still woke like a soldier ready for crisis at any hour. "Everything okay, Bryn?" "I challenged them, Dad. Tomorrow morning. Full evaluation. Thorne is going to try to embarrass me in front of the command." Silence on the line. Chime. "Then I trained with men like Thorne back in the 80s. They're not bad men, just afraid the world is leaving them behind." "So what do I do?" "Same thing Whitaker and I learned in Berlin. Show them their assumptions are the real weakness. Don't beat them. Transform them. And if they won't transform," Clayton's voice carried the weight of 40 years in uniform, "then you transform yourself into exactly what Donovan asked you to become. You become the standard they have to measure themselves against. Not by proving you're as strong as them, by proving strength isn't the only thing that matters." After they hung up, Bryn returned to her gear preparation. She laid out her equipment with meticulous care, checking each piece running through contingencies. Tomorrow would either validate everything she'd worked for or confirm every prejudice Thorne and his men carried. Either way, she would demonstrate what Captain James Donovan had tried to teach her in Kandahar, that the most dangerous warrior isn't the strongest or the fastest. The most dangerous warrior is the one who's already survived their own death and has nothing left to prove except a promise to the fallen. The fog would roll in before dawn. 5 Marines would try to humiliate her, and Bryn Callahan would show them what quiet competence looked like when forged in Afghan fire and tempered by the blood of better men than any of them. The crucible was set. Tomorrow would separate assumption from reality, prejudice from truth. Tomorrow would begin the transformation of 5 men who thought they knew what strength meant. Tomorrow, the real education would begin. The quarters assigned to tactical instructors at Coronado were Spartan by design, 8 by 10 feet of concrete and regulation furniture designed to remind warriors that comfort was a luxury. Bryn sat on the edge of her bunk at 2200 hours, the world beyond her window, dark except for security lights, casting long shadows across the base. The single photograph from Kandahar rested against the lamp beside her bed. Captain James Donovan's face, the only one visible in a sea of digitally obscured teammates, smiled with the confidence of a man who'd believed he was invincible. 32 years old in that photo taken 3 days before the ambush. 3 days before 17 minutes changed everything. Bryn's left hand trembled as she held his challenge coin, the brass worn smooth from years of handling. The tremor started at her wrist, traveled through fingers that would never fully feel again, manifested the nerve damage that no amount of surgery could completely repair. Her hand shook not from weakness, but from memory, from muscle tissue that remembered the weight of a vehicle door crushing down while she maintained pressure on a dying man's chest. The flashback came without warning, triggered by the metallic smell of gun oil from her cleaned equipment. Suddenly, she was back in the helicopter. Donovan's eyes locked on hers as he struggled to speak through blood filling his throat. The medical team worked frantically around them, but she'd known with absolute certainty that he was dying. Had known it from the first moment she'd pressed her hand against his chest and felt how much blood was pumping through her fingers. He hadn't talked about the pain, hadn't begged for morphine or cried out for his mother. In his final conscious moments, Captain James Donovan had talked about his daughter Emma, 6 years old, who'd just started soccer. He'd made Bryn promise to tell Emma that her father had been more than a warrior, more than the uniform and the medals and the classified missions. He'd wanted his daughter to know he'd been human. Bryn had made that promise while her own hand was barely attached, while her body was going into shock from blood loss. She'd promised, and then Donovan had died. And then she'd died heart-stopping for 43 seconds until they'd shocked her back. She'd died again during surgery, gone for 2 full minutes into darkness before returning. Some part of her had stayed in that darkness. Some part of her would always be in that helicopter, feeling Donovan's heartbeat fade under her palm. Her phone vibrated against the desk. A text from Colonel Whitaker, brief and professional. Thorne filed official review board request. Claims training standards compromised. Board scheduled 2 weeks. Good hunting tomorrow. Bryn set down the challenge coin and moved to her equipment locker. Inside, beneath her standard issue gear, lay the folder she'd hoped never to open at Coronado. Her real service record, the classified one that listed operations in countries the United States had never officially entered. The document that detailed her actual role with SEAL Team 4, Not the fiction of intelligence support, but the reality of what she'd done. The record made for sobering reading. 16 operations across 6 countries. Syria in 2021, where she'd helped bury 8 men in an unmarked grave after a mission so sensitive that acknowledging American involvement would have triggered international crisis. 3 Bronze Stars, 1 with Valor Device for actions under fire. 2 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat. A Navy Cross recommendation that had been buried because awarding it would require explaining how a woman had earned it when women weren't officially in direct ground combat roles. Her operational call sign jumped out from the page surgeon, not earned through medical training, but through her ability to extract critical assets from impossible situations with clinical precision. She'd been called surgeon after a hostage rescue in Syria, where she'd cut through 3 separate defensive perimeters with the methodical efficiency of a scalpel cutting tissue. Revealing this record would solve everything. Would silence Thorne's complaints, would validate her authority, would prove beyond doubt that she'd earned her position. It would also compromise ongoing operations, burn intelligence sources, and potentially endanger other female operators working in the same gray zones of official policy. Captain Donovan hadn't asked her to win arguments. He'd asked her to make the next generation better. That meant teaching, not proving. That meant demonstrating capability through action, not through waving classified documents. Bryn touched the dragon balance tattoo through her shirt, feeling the raised skin where ink had been driven deep into tissue. The coordinates of Donovan's death would stay with her forever, a navigation point marking where she'd learned the true cost of service. But tomorrow wasn't about the past. Tomorrow was about showing 5 Marines that their assumptions about strength were dangerously limited. She made her decision the way she'd been trained, quickly and without emotion. Tomorrow she would give Thorne exactly what he'd asked for, a demonstration of standards, but not the kind he expected. In combat, the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who looks strongest. It's the one who's already survived their own death and has nothing left to lose. The darkness before dawn carries a particular quality on military installations, a held breath before the day's violence begins. At 0330, Bryn was already awake, had been awake for the past hour, running through mental rehearsals of the evolution ahead. She dressed in the dark muscle memory, guiding her hands through equipment checks that had become ritual. By 0345, she stood in the pre-dawn cold, waiting. The fog rolled in from the Pacific, thick enough to muffle sound, dense enough to make the obstacle course staging area feel isolated from the rest of the world. The kind of fog that swallowed mistakes and amplified consequences. Colonel Whitaker arrived at 0350, moving with the careful precision of a man whose leg had never quite healed right from Berlin shrapnel. He carried a clipboard and coffee, the steam from his cup disappearing into the fog like ghosts. "You don't have to do this, Lieutenant. I can shut down his complaint through official channels." Bryn shook her head. "That just confirms what he already believes, that I need protection, that standards are being bent for me. And if you fail, if he's right, and you can't keep up, then he's right, sir, but he's not right." Whitaker studied her for a long moment. "Your father called me last night, said to tell you that Berlin taught him the difference between being strong and being strong enough." Before Bryn could respond, the sound of boots on gravel announced the arrival of Thorne's team. They emerged from the fog like raiders from some ancient war, 5 men carrying full combat loads, confident in their physical superiority. Master Sergeant Garrett Thorne led them, his face set in an expression of grim satisfaction. They'd come to prove a point. They believed the next 2 hours would validate every assumption they carried about women in combat roles. They were about to learn the difference between assumption and reality. Whitaker checked his watch. 0400 exactly. "Gentlemen, Lieutenant Callahan, welcome to your advanced tactical evaluation. This evolution has been sanctioned by Base Command as a comprehensive assessment of tactical proficiency, combat casualty care, operational decision-making, and performance under stress." He paused, letting the formal language sink in. The evaluation consists of 5 phases, each designed to test different aspects of operational capability. You will be scored on speed, accuracy, decision quality, and adherence to tactical doctrine. Lieutenant Callahan has designed this assessment based on actual SEAL team selection protocols. Thorne's smile widened. He thought he'd won before the first phase began. After all, SEAL standards were notoriously brutal, designed to break all but the most physically capable. Surely a woman, even one with her supposed qualifications, couldn't match 5 Marine veterans in a test of pure physical endurance. Bryn maintained her parade rest position, her breathing controlled, her focus absolute. Around her, the fog swirled like smoke from a battlefield, and in the distance, the Pacific Ocean crashed against the shore with the rhythm of artillery. The first test began in water. The pool facility at Coronado had been built specifically for maritime operations training, Olympic-sized and deep enough for combat swimming drills. Under normal circumstances, it was heated, comfortable, almost pleasant. Whitaker had ordered the heating systems shut down 12 hours earlier. The water temperature now matched the Pacific Ocean, cold enough to induce hypothermia in under 30 minutes for unprepared swimmers. Phase 1, Whitaker announced. Full combat load, water confidence. 60 pounds of gear, indefinite tread time with tactical problem-solving component. You will maintain buoyancy while I call out grid coordinates. You will memorize and repeat those coordinates on command. You will field strip and reassemble your M4 rifle underwater while maintaining tactical awareness of your surroundings. Any failure to maintain buoyancy results in immediate disqualification. Thorne's smile flickered. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd anticipated a ruck march, maybe an obstacle course, something where his size and strength would be decisive advantages. But water was the great equalizer. In water, technique mattered more than muscle mass. Efficiency trumped power. All 6 participants entered the pool simultaneously. The shock of cold water drove the breath from Bishop's lungs in an audible gasp. Merrick's face went pale. Even Thorne, with all his experience, grimaced at the temperature. Hayes, youngest and least experienced, immediately began treading too aggressively, burning energy at an unsustainable rate. Bryn's entry was controlled, deliberate. She'd trained in water cold enough to stop hearts, had conducted maritime operations in Arctic conditions. This was uncomfortable but manageable. She established her treading rhythm immediately, minimal movement, maximum efficiency, weight distributed perfectly to maintain buoyancy without exhausting her legs. The first 3 minutes passed in relative quiet, just 6 people treading water in full gear while Colonel Whitaker watched from poolside. Then he began calling coordinates. November 324718, Whiskey 1171423. Memorize. The coordinates meant nothing out of context, just numbers to be retained under stress. But Bryn recognized them immediately. They were the exact GPS location where Captain Donovan had died, the coordinates tattooed on her skin beneath the dragon and balance. The universe offering her reminder of why she was here, what this cost. Thorne repeated the coordinates confidently. His team followed suit, their voices steady. They were handling this phase well, better than Bryn had anticipated. But they had only been in the water 3 minutes. The real test came later. Minute 5, Whitaker added a second set of coordinates. Minute 7, he ordered weapon field stripping. The Marines fumbled with their M4's underwater fingers, clumsy from cold and lack of practice. Water complicated everything, made simple tasks complex, turned routine procedures into desperate struggles. Bryn's hands moved with mechanical precision. She'd practiced this drill so many times that her fingers knew the sequence without conscious thought. Takedown pin released upper and lower receivers, separated bolt carrier group extracted. Each piece maintained in her awareness even while submerged. No piece dropped, no component lost. Minute 10 arrived and Hayes was showing serious signs of distress. His treading had become frantic, his breathing labored. Brennan wasn't much better, burning energy at an unsustainable pace. Even Thorne's confident expression had begun to crack, replaced by something closer to concentration, edged with concern. Bryn appeared unchanged. Her breathing remained controlled, her movements minimal. While the Marines fought the water, she worked with it using the principles of buoyancy and fluid dynamics that she'd learned not from textbooks, but from operations where failure meant drowning. At minute 12, Whitaker called for reassembly. The Marines struggled, their hands shaking from cold and fatigue. Bishop dropped his firing pin twice before successfully reinstalling it. Merrick took 3 attempts to properly seat his bolt carrier group. Thorne completed the task, but with none of his earlier confidence, just grim determination. Bryn had already finished. She'd exited the water at minute 11, her M4 fully assembled and function checked, while Thorne's team still struggled with basic components. She stood poolside without making a show of her success, simply waiting for the others to complete the evolution. When Hayes finally dragged himself from the water, at minute 15, gasping and shaking, Whitaker's expression revealed nothing. He simply made notes on his clipboard and announced, Phase 2 begins in 15 minutes. Navigation and tactical combat casualty care. 5 checkpoints across base. You'll receive coordinates for each checkpoint only once. No GPS, no maps compass, and pace count only. Each checkpoint contains a casualty requiring different TCCC protocols. Speed matters, but accuracy matters more. Dead casualties don't give you points. The Marines exchanged glances. They were already tired, already cold, already doubting their assumption that this would be easy, and they'd completed only one phase of 5. The navigation course wound through Coronado's training areas. 5 checkpoints spread across terrain, designed to test both physical endurance and tactical thinking. The course incorporated obstacles that forced route selection elevation changes, that demanded pace count adjustment, and time pressure, that rewarded efficiency over caution. Whitaker provided the first coordinate set once speaking clearly but without repetition. Checkpoint 1, November 324755, Whiskey 1171342. Thorne's team huddled immediately, trying to confirm they'd all heard correctly. Precious seconds wasted in verification. Bryn was already moving, compass in hand, counting her paces with the mechanical precision of someone who'd navigated through hostile territory where a single wrong turn meant ambush. She reached checkpoint 1 40 seconds ahead of the nearest pursuer. The casualty mannequin lay in a mock battlefield scenario, arterial blood pumping from a simulated femoral wound, the kind of injury that killed in minutes without immediate intervention. Junctional tourniquets were tricky, required precise placement and massive pressure to occlude major vessels at the groin. Many combat medics struggled with the procedure under ideal conditions. Under pressure, with a clock running and teammates watching, the failure rate climbed dramatically. Thorne's team arrived to find Bryn already moving to checkpoint 2, her casualty stabilized in under 30 seconds. They gathered around their own mannequin, and the confusion was immediate. Where exactly did the tourniquet need to be placed? How much pressure? Was this tight enough? Bishop tried first, his massive hands fumbling with equipment designed for precision rather than strength. After a full minute, he stepped back frustrated. Brennan took over, achieving better results, but still losing another 2 minutes to uncertainty. 3 minutes total to stabilize a wound that would have killed a real casualty in 4. They'd failed the scenario without knowing it, and they had 4 more checkpoints ahead. Checkpoint 2 demanded needle decompression for tension pneumothorax. The casualty mannequin showed the classic signs: distended neck veins, absent breath sounds on one side, tracheal deviation. A collapsed lung requiring immediate intervention, or the patient would die from pressure buildup in the chest cavity. The procedure was straightforward in theory. Insert a large bore needle into the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line, release the trapped air, relieve the pressure. In practice, with adrenaline flowing and hands shaking from cold water and exertion, even trained medics could miss the insertion point or angle the needle incorrectly. Bryn's scarred hands worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed this procedure in the back of moving vehicles under fire. Her insertion was textbook perfect, the simulated air release immediate. Total time from assessment to treatment, 18 seconds. When Thorne's team arrived, they found her already departed. They gathered around their mannequin and immediately began arguing. Airway or breathing priority? Did tension pneumothorax require immediate decompression, or could it wait? Where exactly was the second intercostal space? Hayes advocated for focusing on airway management first. Merrick insisted the chest wound was more urgent. Thorne tried to impose order, but his own uncertainty showed through. They eventually completed the procedure, but only after nearly 4 minutes of debate and 2 failed insertion attempts. They were falling further behind, not just in time, but in confidence. Each checkpoint revealed new gaps in their knowledge, new ways that assumption failed to match reality. Checkpoint 3 was traumatic amputation requiring proper tourniquet application to a severed limb. This was bread and butter combat medicine, the kind of scenario every Marine had trained for. Surely here they could make up lost time. But as Bryn had demonstrated during the training, that Thorne had interrupted strength wasn't the critical factor. Knowing exactly where to place the tourniquet, understanding the biomechanics of pressure, application, having the confidence to act immediately rather than hesitating, these were what separated successful treatment from casualties bleeding out. Bryn had placed her tourniquet in under 15 seconds, properly positioned 2 inches above the wound windlass, secured with the precise tension required to stop arterial flow without causing unnecessary tissue damage. She'd been taught this procedure by Captain Donovan in a schoolhouse outside Kandahar, and she'd used it in combat 3 times to save lives. Thorne's team burned another 3 minutes on debate and adjustment. Their final tourniquet placement was acceptable, but far from optimal, and the time they'd lost was time a real casualty wouldn't have. By checkpoint 4, the Marines were moving slower. Their confidence shattered their assumptions in ruins. The sucking chest wound scenario should have been straightforward, a 3-sided occlusive dressing and applied with tape, but their cold fingers fumbled with the materials and their exhausted minds struggled to remember proper protocols. Bryn had maintained perfect security awareness while treating her casualty head on a swivel weapon positioned for immediate access, treating from a covered position. The Marines clumped together, forgot their tactical fundamentals, made themselves a perfect target for any enemy who might be watching. Checkpoint 5 was the crusher. Multiple casualties, priority triage required. Red, yellow, green, black. Immediate delayed, minimal expectant. The classification that separated those who could be saved from those who couldn't, the brutal calculus of combat medicine, where resources were finite and choices meant life or death. Bryn had moved through the scenario like smoke, assessing each casualty in seconds, making decisions without hesitation. She'd learned this procedure from Donovan, and in the field she'd used it to save the savable, while acknowledging that some were beyond help. The Marines watched as she worked, and in that moment they began to understand. This wasn't theory to her. This was memory. When they attempted their own triage, the paralysis of choice overwhelmed them. Who to treat first, who to accept as loss. The decisions that seemed so clear in a classroom discussion became impossible under pressure. They eventually completed the scenario, but they knew they'd failed in ways that mattered. The live fire range was already set up when the exhausted group arrived for Phase 3 targets positioned at multiple distances, both static and moving, with communication equipment that would require constant verbal coordination. Standard SEAL qualification protocols, the kind of evolution that separated good shooters from great ones. But Bryn had added her own modification, and it was diabolical. Each shooter would call shots for a partner who was blindfolded, requiring absolute trust and precise verbal communication. You couldn't rely on your own eyes. You had to trust someone else's guidance completely, had to translate verbal instruction into physical action without confirmation. The evolution exposed every weakness in team dynamics. It revealed who trusted whom, who could communicate clearly under pressure, who maintained composure when stripped of their primary sense. Whitaker explained the rules, and Bryn watched understanding dawn on Thorne's face. He'd realized the trap. This wasn't about shooting ability. It was about trust, about whether you could surrender control to someone else, about whether your ego would allow you to be vulnerable. Thorne chose Bishop as his blindfolded shooter, a logical choice. Bishop had qualified expert with multiple weapon systems, had the raw skill to succeed if properly guided. Thorne's callouts were aggressive, confident, exactly what you'd expect from a Marine Master Sergeant with 17 years experience. But after 3 misses in rapid succession, Thorne's frustration exploded. He grabbed Bishop's rifle, trying to physically adjust his aim, violating the fundamental rule of the evolution: verbal guidance, only no physical contact. It was a small violation, but it revealed everything about Thorne's leadership philosophy. When verbal instruction failed, he resorted to force. Whitaker noted the violation but didn't stop the evolution. This was about learning, and some lessons required complete failure before understanding could begin. When Bryn's turn came, she chose Hayes as her blindfolded shooter. Hayes, the youngest, the one who'd mocked her about lowering standards, who'd smiled at the cruelty of his teammates. She chose him, deliberately choosing to demonstrate trust in the person who'd shown her the least respect. Hayes stood rigid, blindfold, secure, rifle ready, terrified. He'd qualified expert marksman in his Marine training, but that was different from this. This required surrendering all control, trusting completely in guidance from someone he'd spent a week trying to undermine. Bryn's voice became a scalpel, cutting through his fear with precision. Target 2 o'clock, 35 meters, chest high. Wind left to right at 5 knots. Elevation adjustment, 1 click up. Breathe, control your breathing. In through the nose, shoot. Through the mouth, feel the trigger. Don't pull, squeeze. On my count. 3, 2, 1. The shot broke perfectly. Center mass hit at 35 meters, guided by nothing but voice and trust. They continued through the evolution, Brin's instructions mechanical and precise, Hayes's execution improving with each repetition. By the end, he'd achieved a 90% hit rate, better than he'd ever shot with his eyes open. When Hayes removed his blindfold, his hands were shaking. Not from cold or exertion, but from realization. He'd just performed at a higher level than ever before in his life, guided by the woman he'd dismissed as incompetent. The cognitive dissonance was written across his face, the slow crumbling of assumptions that had seemed so solid an hour earlier. The Marines gathered for Phase 4 with exhaustion written in every line of their bodies. 2 hours into the evolution, their confidence had transformed into something closer to desperate determination. They'd been humbled by water, shown their knowledge gaps in casualty care, forced to confront their trust issues in live fire. And they still had 2 phases remaining. The tactical problem was complex, requiring movement through an urban operations course while maintaining communication with a simulated operations center. Standard stuff, the kind of scenario every Marine had trained for. But halfway through, Colonel Whitaker introduced the wild card that transformed everything. Sergeant Finn Merrick collapsed. Not part of the scenario, not simulated. Real medical emergency, severe dehydration combined with heat exhaustion, the kind of condition that could kill if not treated immediately. His body simply gave up, pushed beyond its limits by cold water, followed by intense physical exertion in full combat load. Thorne froze. For perhaps 3 seconds. Master Sergeant Garrett Thorne, 17 years of force recon experience, 2 Bronze Stars, countless combat operations, froze completely. His brain couldn't process the shift from exercise to emergency, couldn't transition from scenario to reality. His team looked to him for guidance and found paralysis. Brin moved in 12 seconds. She broke from the tactical problem, crossed the distance to Merrick's collapse form, and began actual treatment while her mind cataloged symptoms and prioritized interventions. Heat exhaustion presenting as altered mental status. Rapid pulse, cool, clammy skin. Not yet heat stroke, but close. Minutes away from serious harm. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. IV line established in Merrick's arm, saline flowing to address dehydration. Core temperature assessment via thermometer. Vitals checked systematically, pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate, all while maintaining security and awareness of weapon position for access, body position, allowing for rapid movement if the situation evolved. But here was her mastery on full display. She never stopped directing the tactical problem. Uses Merrick's real casualty as a teaching point for combat care under fire, showed how medical treatment had to integrate with tactical requirements, demonstrated the multitasking that separated good operators from exceptional ones. She delegated roles with clinical precision. Bishop Security Perimeter Northeast Sector. Brennan established communication with medical. We need ambulance, this position. Hayes assist with IV. Hold the bag elevated. Maintain pressure. Thorne document everything. Time treatments, response to interventions. If this goes bad, that documentation saves careers. By putting Thorne in charge of documentation, she forced him to watch, to record her expertise, to be witness to the capability he'd spent a week trying to deny. It was brilliant and ruthless, making him complicit in acknowledging her competence. The ambulance arrived at minute 8. Merrick was conscious by then, responsive vitals improving. He'd be fine, kept overnight for observation, but suffering no permanent harm. But the evolution had revealed something none of them could deny. By minute 40 of Phase 4, the Marines weren't fighting Brin anymore. They were fighting to keep up with her, struggling to match her pace, her competence, her ability to function at peak efficiency under conditions that broke their own performance down. The antagonism that had defined their first week together had transformed into something else entirely. Not quite respect yet, but desperate awareness that their assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. Evolution paused, Merrick evacuated, and the remaining 5 participants stood in the fading light of late morning, exhausted and humbled, and forever changed. Thorne walked away from the group, found a bench near the training area perimeter, and sat heavily. His hands shook as he removed his helmet, and for perhaps the first time in 17 years of military service, Master Sergeant Garrett Thorne confronted the possibility that he'd been fundamentally wrong about something that mattered. Brin approached slowly, giving him space to process. She sat beside him without asking permission, 2 warriors temporarily separated from the machinery of evaluation and performance. You have children. Master Sergeant, Thorne looked at her, surprised by the question. Daughter, Lydia, 14, wants to be a Marine. My father was Navy corpsman, Cold War Berlin, 1985. Saved 12 men, including Colonel Wistaker, during a classified operation. Chemical weapons threat, enemy fire, everything going wrong at once. She paused, choosing her words carefully. He told me once that standards don't protect weak people from strong missions. They prepare strong people for impossible ones. The question isn't whether someone meets your idea of standard. The question is whether they can complete the mission when everything's falling apart. Thorne was silent, processing. Your daughter won't become you. She'll become something you can't imagine yet. Question is whether you'll prepare her or limit her. Whether you'll give her truth or comfortable lies. Bryn stood, preparing to return to the evolution. 0600 tomorrow. Final phase. Bring your best, Master Sergeant. I'm bringing mine. She walked away, leaving Thorne alone with thoughts he'd been avoiding for years. The sun had burned through the morning fog, and in the clear light, he could see the Pacific Ocean, stretching to the horizon, vast and indifferent to human certainty. Somewhere in that vastness, men and women were conducting operations that would never be acknowledged, serving in ways that would never be celebrated, meeting standards that had nothing to do with the comfortable assumptions of garrison Marines who'd forgotten that warfare rewarded efficiency over ego. Tomorrow they would complete the evaluation with a kill house hostage rescue scenario. Tomorrow Bryn Callahan would demonstrate the final lesson, the one that would break Thorne's worldview completely. But tonight he sat on a bench and thought about his daughter, 14 years old, and wondered what kind of father he'd been, what kind of world he'd prepared her for, what kind of man he wanted to become. The transformation had begun, though he didn't fully recognize it yet. The evolution would continue tomorrow, but the real test wasn't about physical capability anymore. It was about whether 5 Marines could surrender their assumptions long enough to learn from someone who'd paid prices they couldn't imagine. In her quarters that night, Bryn cleaned her equipment and prepared for the final phase. Her left hand trembled, as it always did, after stress, nerve damage, manifesting through shakes that medical intervention couldn't prevent. She held Captain Donovan's challenge coin and remembered his final words. Make them better than us. Tomorrow she would complete that promise, would demonstrate the final proof that standards weren't about exclusion, but elevation. Tomorrow, Master Sergeant Garrett Thorne would face the truth that had been waiting for him since the first moment he'd chosen contempt over curiosity. Tomorrow the revelation would come. Dawn broke over Coronado like a promise, the sky bleeding from black to deep purple to the color of old blood. The kind of light that made everything look both beautiful and ominous, that reminded men who'd seen combat that sunrise was when the enemy liked to attack, when defenders were tired and vulnerable and hoping the night had passed without incident. Lieutenant Bryn Callahan stood alone at the edge of the Pacific, watching the waves crash against the shore with the rhythm of artillery fire. Her left hand trembled as she traced the dragon balance tattoo through her shirt, feeling the raised skin where coordinates had been permanently marked into her flesh. The numbers that marked Captain James Donovan's death, that marked her own death and resurrection, that marked the moment she'd understood what service truly cost. She'd slept 3 hours dreamless and deep, the sleep of someone who'd learned to rest whenever opportunity allowed. Years of irregular operations had trained her body to shut down completely when safe, to recharge in whatever moments peace provided. Behind her, the base was stirring to life, early risers beginning their physical training, the machinery of military routine grinding into motion. Today was the final phase. The kill house. The scenario that would either validate everything she'd demonstrated over the past 2 days or reveal some hidden weakness that Thorne could seize upon. Not that she believed there was weakness to find. She'd run hundreds of hostage rescue scenarios, had conducted the real thing in hostile territory where mistakes meant dead teammates and international incidents. But doubt was healthy. Overconfidence killed. She'd seen too many talented operators die because they'd believed their own legend, had stopped questioning their assumptions, had decided they were too skilled to fail. Captain Donovan had been talented beyond measure, and he died in a ditch in Afghanistan because sometimes talent wasn't enough. Her phone vibrated. A text from Colonel Whitaker sent at 0530. Harrison inbound, observing final phase from TOC. Whatever happens today, your father would be proud. The mention of her father brought unexpected emotion. Master Chief Clayton Callahan, 67 years old, retired in San Diego, just 40 miles from where she stood. She'd called him last night after the tactical problem, after Merrick's collapse, after her conversation with Thorne. He'd listened to her describe the day's events, and then he'd told her something she'd carry forever. Your mother asked me once after Berlin why I kept going back, why I kept taking the dangerous assignments when I could have stayed stateside, trained others, lived a safer life. I told her the same thing I'm telling you now. Someone has to stand in the gap between what we say we value and what we're willing to do about it. You're standing in that gap, Bryn. Don't step back now. She wouldn't step back. Not for Thorne's prejudice, not for bureaucratic convenience, not for her own exhaustion. Captain Donovan had asked her to make the next generation better, and today she would complete that promise. The kill house loomed against the morning sky, a concrete structure designed to replicate urban combat environments. 2 stories, multiple rooms, countless angles for ambush and disaster. The scenario today would incorporate maritime insertion, chemical weapons protocols, and hostage rescue under time pressure. Everything that could go wrong in a modern special operations mission, compressed into 30 minutes of controlled chaos. Thorne's team assembled at 0600, precisely looking worse for the wear after 2 days of physical and psychological punishment. Bishop's eyes were red from exhaustion. Brennan moved with the stiffness of someone whose muscles had been pushed beyond their normal limits. Hayes looked younger than his 24 years, stripped of the arrogance that had defined their first meeting. And Merrick, released from medical observation just 2 hours earlier, against doctor recommendations, stood apart from the others, with the haunted expression of someone who'd confronted their own mortality. Master Sergeant Garrett Thorne appeared last, and something in his bearing had shifted. The aggressive confidence was gone, replaced by something harder to define. Not defeat exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that the world was more complex than his assumptions had allowed. Colonel Whitaker stood before them with the clipboard that had documented every evolution, every failure, every reluctant success. Beside him stood a man Bryn recognized from photographs but had never met in person. Captain Martin Harrison, SEAL Team 4's operations officer, the man who'd commanded her during 16 operations across 6 countries. Harrison's presence changed everything. He was legend in the special operations community, the officer who'd planned the Syria operations that nobody talked about, who'd coordinated actions in countries where American involvement would have triggered international crisis. His appearance at a routine training evolution was unprecedented, impossible to explain, except as signal that something significant was occurring. Whitaker's briefing was professional and concise. Phase 5, hostage rescue scenario, kill house environment. Maritime insertion via fast rope from helicopter breach and clear under chemical weapons protocols. 5 operators, 1 designated leader. 30 minutes for planning and execution. Success criteria: hostage secured alive. Enemy neutralized, 0 friendly casualties. Captain Harrison will observe from the Tactical Operations Center, evaluating decision quality and tactical execution. He paused, letting the weight of Harrison's observations sink in. Master Sergeant Thorne, you're designated leader for this evolution. Lieutenant Callahan will observe from TOC and provide oversight. Any questions? Thorne's team exchanged glances. This was their chance to redeem themselves, to prove that the past 2 days had been anomalies, that given proper tactical scenario, they could demonstrate the competence that had earned them selection for advanced training. No questions, sir, Thorne replied. His voice carried none of its earlier arrogance, just professional acknowledgement of mission received. The planning phase consumed 20 minutes of intense discussion. Thorne's team huddled over blueprints of the kill house, marking entry points, identifying fatal funnels, discussing breach sequences, and room-clearing protocols. Their planning was solid, built on Marine Corps doctrine and years of practical experience. Textbook execution of proven tactics. Bryn watched from the TOC alongside Whitaker and Harrison, multiple camera feeds showing different angles of the kill house interior. The hostage, played by a training dummy equipped with sensors, sat in a second-floor room surrounded by simulated enemy positions. The scenario was designed to be difficult but solvable, requiring speed and precision in equal measure. Your assessment, Lieutenant Harrison's question, carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. This was test within test evaluation of her ability to analyze and predict. Solid plan, sir. Conservative approach. Methodical clearing, priorities their strengths. They'll succeed if the scenario plays straight. But if intelligence changes mid-mission, their plan lacks flexibility. They've optimized for the expected rather than preparing for the unexpected. Harrison nodded, made a note on his own clipboard. Proceed when ready, Master Sergeant. The helicopter insertion was textbook perfect. Four Marines fast roped from the hovering aircraft with practiced efficiency, establishing security perimeter within seconds of hitting the ground. Their movement was professional, coordinated, exactly what you'd expect from elite infantry with years of training. The breach began with explosive charges on the primary entry point, followed immediately by team movement through the fatal funnel. Room 1 cleared in 4 seconds, precise and efficient. Room 2 in 6 seconds, slightly slower due to complex geometry, but still well within acceptable parameters. Thorne's commands over the radio net were clear and professional. He'd learned from the past 2 days, had adjusted his leadership style to focus on mission rather than ego. His team responded with discipline that spoke to legitimate competence, the kind of capability that had earned them their positions. They were succeeding, clearing rooms with mechanical efficiency, maintaining security, communicating effectively. By the time they reached the second floor, Bryn could see the confidence returning to their movements. They were going to complete this evolution successfully, were going to prove that despite their failures in other phases, they could execute the core mission of direct action. Then the scenario shifted. All stations, this is TOC, intelligence update. Hostage location changed. Possible IED in original room. Multiple enemy positions unconfirmed. Request updated assessment and tactical recommendation. The sudden change in parameters was designed to test adaptability to see how operators responded when their careful plans became obsolete mid-mission. It was the kind of thing that happened constantly in real operations, the friction that separated good teams from exceptional ones. Thorne's response came after 5 seconds of silence, and Bryn could hear the uncertainty in his voice. TOC, request clarification on new hostage position. Negative recon 21. Insufficient intelligence for precise location. Enemy activity suggests northwest quadrant, second floor. Recommend immediate assessment and revised entry plan. More silence. Thorne's team had stopped moving, caught in the paralysis of too many options and insufficient information. Their textbook plan had become liability, their careful preparation now constraint rather than advantage. TOC request additional time for planning. Thorne finally transmitted, and in those words, Bryn heard the echo of every mistake she'd seen in combat. The belief that more planning would reduce risk, that hesitation could be disguised as caution, that waiting for perfect information was somehow professional rather than paralytic. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the radio net, Captain Harrison speaking not from beside her in the TOC, but from a secure line originating in Virginia, his words transmitted through encrypted channels to reach every operator simultaneously. Surgeon, this is Blackwater Actual. The kill house froze. Every Marine stopped moving. Every weapon lowered slightly. Every head turned towards speakers as if physical proximity would help them understand what they were hearing. Surgeon wasn't a call sign they recognized, but Blackwater Actual was legend. The operations officer who'd commanded the Syria missions, who'd planned actions that existed in the gray zones of plausible deniability, who'd coordinated strikes that would never be acknowledged, but had eliminated threats that would never materialize. His appearance on this training evolution made no sense, violated every expectation of how routine assessment worked. Unless this wasn't routine. Unless something else entirely was happening. Bryn's response was immediate and professional, the voice of someone slipping into role as naturally as breathing. Blackwater Actual Surgeon confirms 5 operators in breach, standard stack, conventional, clear in progress. Recommend immediate transition to dynamic entry. Northwest corner presents fatal funnel at current approach angle. How copy? Solid copy, Surgeon. Your assessment matches our simulation runs. Colonel Whitaker, are you monitoring? Whitaker's voice joined the net, formal and deliberate. Monitoring, Captain Harrison, confirming Lieutenant Callahan's tactical assessment. Colonel, for the official record, I'm confirming Lieutenant Callahan's certification and operational background. The air in the TOC seemed to crystallize, every molecule suddenly dense with significance. Bryn felt her left hand begin to tremble, nerve damage manifesting under stress. She'd known this moment would come, eventually had accepted it as inevitable when she'd chosen to pursue this assignment. But knowing and experiencing were different universes. Harrison's voice continued, each word landing with the weight of official documentation. Lieutenant Bryn Callahan completed SEAL Team 4 selection in 2019, graduating top of her class. Maintained off official records for operational security purposes. Attached to Team 4 for 16 operations across 6 countries between 2020 and 2020. In the kill house, Master Sergeant Thorne's hand holding the radio had begun to shake visibly on camera feed. His world was disassembling in real time, every assumption that had defined his identity crumbling under the weight of facts he couldn't deny. 3 Bronze Stars, 1 with Valor Device for actions under fire in Kandahar Province 2020, 2 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat, 1 Navy Cross recommendation currently pending final approval. Operational call sign surgeon earned during hostage extraction in Syria 2021. Harrison paused, letting each credential sink in. Lieutenant Callahan is the only operator in modern special operations history to successfully complete Hell Week twice. Once through standard SEAL training pipeline, once undercover as foreign military trainee to evaluate training protocols. She has been declared clinically dead twice in service to this nation and resuscitated both times. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of electronic equipment. Master Sergeant Thorne, Harrison's voice carried something new now, not quite reproach, but firm correction. You requested an instructor who met the highest standards. You're currently being evaluated by an operator who has more confirmed combat operations than your entire team combined. She literally wrote the manual your Marines are attempting to follow. The final piece of information landed with devastating precision. The tactical recommendation she just provided is identical to the solution our planning cell developed after 6 hours of analysis. She generated it in 15 seconds based on incomplete information and tactical intuition earned through operations you will never read about. In the TOC, Bryn stood perfectly still, maintaining the professional bearing that had carried her through every crisis in her career. But inside, emotions churned. Relief that the truth was finally exposed. Anxiety about operations that might be compromised. Sadness that it had taken this revelation to break through prejudice that should never have existed. Inside the kill house, Corporal Tucker Hayes found his voice. Young, shaken, but with courage that commanded respect, he keyed his mic and spoke words that cut through the tension. Lieutenant Callahan, Surgeon, what's your recommended entry? The question acknowledged everything. Her rank, her call sign, her expertise. It was surrender and respect combined, the admission that assumptions had been catastrophically wrong and that continuing in ignorance would be professionally fatal. Bryn's response was calm, instructive, the tone of someone teaching rather than proving. Southeast window provides elevated angle without fatal funnel concerns. 2 operators through glass on flashbang detonation, 3 through secondary door, simultaneously 15-degree offset to avoid friendly fire intersection. Flashbang only after visual confirmation of hostage location. Chemicals in this scenario make incendiary devices too risky. She paused, then added gently, the plan you developed was solid Recon 21. You optimized for speed over adaptability. In combat, the second quality often matters more than the first. Thorne's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, audible only because of sensitive microphones. Why didn't you tell us? Why let us spend a week? Why let us? The question trailed off, too large for radio transmission, too complex for simple answer. Bryn waited 3 heartbeats before responding, choosing words that would matter. Because Master Sergeant, my job isn't to prove myself to you. It's to make you better than you thought possible. Captain James Donovan asked me to create warriors, not win arguments. The name Donovan hung in the air like revelation. Every operator in the special operations community knew the story, knew the legend of Kandahar 2020, knew about the unnamed SEAL who'd held pressure on a chest wound for 17 minutes under fire, while their own hand was nearly severed. The story had circulated through team rooms and training centers, had become modern parable about courage and sacrifice. They'd just never known the SEAL was her, was the woman they'd mocked and undermined and tried to break. Hayes spoke again, his voice carrying understanding born from humiliation. The legend says the medic died too, says they flatlined and came back. I did, Bryn confirmed simply. 43 seconds the first time, 2 minutes during surgery. They brought me back both times. The kill house remained frozen. 5 Marines processing information that rewrote everything they thought they understood about capability and courage and what it meant to serve. Master Sergeant Garrett Thorne made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He set down his weapon, carefully removed his helmet with deliberate precision, and keyed his microphone with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Surgeon, this is Recon 21, requesting permission to restart this evolution under your direct command. It was surrender, but surrender with dignity. Acknowledgement of error combined with commitment to learning. The kind of leadership that separated good NCOs from great ones. The willingness to admit mistake and subordinate ego to mission success. Brin's approval came without hesitation. Permission granted to Recon 21. And Thorne, for what it's worth, you've got solid instincts. You just let assumptions to cloud them. We'll work on that. The mission execution under Brin's command was poetry. Each movement coordinated with precision that came from dozens of similar operations conducted under actual fire. Her commands were economical, her timing perfect, her understanding of each operator's capabilities, allowing her to position them for maximum effectiveness. Bishop Brennan's southeast window on my mark. Thorne Hayes' secondary door, 15-degree offset from Bishop's entry vector. Flashbang on 3 count after visual confirmation. Merrick, your security on primary entry. Anyone comes through that door who isn't friendly way, you engage immediately. The breach was surgical. Window glass shattered on flashbang detonation. 2 Marines flowing through the opening with weapons up and scanning. Secondary door opened 2 seconds later. Perfect timing to catch any enemy attempting to respond to the window breach. The hostage was secured in 11 seconds from initial breach to all clear. Perfect execution. Textbook operation. The kind of performance that came from leadership that understood not just tactics but psychology, not just doctrine but the human element that made doctrine effective. In the after-action debrief, Thorne's team stood at attention before Brin for the first time since arriving at Coronado. Not because regulation required it, but because they finally understood what respect meant, what expertise looked like when stripped of comfortable assumptions. Sergeant Finn Merrick recovered from his collapse, but still pale, spoke first. Ma'am, we owe you an apology that words can't adequately express. Brin shook her head. You owe me your best effort tomorrow and the day after, and every day you wear the uniform. That's the only apology I need, and it's paid through service, not words. The finality of her statement closed that chapter of their relationship. What had been antagonism would become something new. Something built on demonstrated competence and hard-won respect. 3 weeks passed between the final evolution and the graduation ceremony, 3 weeks during which Thorne's team completed their advanced training under Brin's instruction with a level of dedication that bordered on fanatical. They'd been given a gift, the opportunity to learn from someone whose expertise had been earned in blood, and they treated that gift with the reverence it deserved. The graduation ceremony for the Advanced Tactical Instructor course took place under a California sky so clear it seemed artificial, and the kind of perfect weather that made Coronado feel like paradise rather than the crucible it actually was. Families had been invited, a rare occurrence for special operations training, but this particular course had taken on significance beyond its original scope. The certificates were signed by 3 men, Colonel Whitaker representing Base Command, Captain Harrison representing SEAL Team 4 in the broader special operations community, and an unprecedented addition, the commanding officer of Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command, a 2-star general who'd flown in specifically for this ceremony. When Corporal Tucker Hayes was called forward to give the class representative speech, the audience expected standard boilerplate about honor and commitment and lessons learned. What they received instead was truth delivered with raw honesty. Hayes stood at the podium, 24 years old, but looking younger, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the assembly with surprising strength. The strongest warrior I've ever met weighs 130 pounds and has hands that shake from nerve damage. She taught us that real strength isn't what you can carry. It's continuing to serve when you have already given everything. It's maintaining standards when lowering them would be easier. It's teaching when proving would be simpler. He paused, looking directly at Brin, who stood with the other instructors. We came here thinking we'd expose a fraud. We came with assumptions about capability and standards and what makes a warrior. We were wrong about everything that mattered. His voice cracked slightly, emotion breaking through professional bearing. The woman we mocked has more confirmed combat operations than our entire team combined. She's been awarded decorations for valor that most of us will never see. She's died in service to this nation and been brought back, and she used that second chance not to rest, but to make us better. Hayes gripped the podium, knuckles white. If my daughter someday tells me she wants to serve, wants to be a Marine, I'll tell her about Lieutenant Callahan. I'll tell her that capability has nothing to do with what you look like and everything to do with what you're willing to sacrifice. I'll tell her that the hardest missions require the best warriors, and the best warriors come in forms we don't always expect. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, the kind of recognition that transcended political calculation or social obligation. These were warriors acknowledging one of their own, accepting truth that had been delivered through demonstration rather than declaration. But the moment that mattered most came the night before in a conversation that took place away from official ceremony and public recognition. Bryn had been in the equipment warehouse checking gear for the next training cycle that would begin Monday when Master Sergeant Thorne found her. He stood in the doorway for a full minute before speaking, and when words finally came, they carried weight of confession. I have a daughter, Lydia, 14 years old. She wants to be a Marine. Bryn set down the equipment she'd been inspecting and turned to face him, giving him her full attention. Thorne pulled out his phone, showed her a photo. A girl in JROTC uniform, young and proud and full of the same certainty that had once defined her father. I've been telling her things, wrong things, about women in combat, about standards being lowered, about how the military was being ruined by social engineering. His voice roughened with emotion. Last week she asked me if what I'd been saying was still true. Asked me if women really couldn't handle combat. And I hesitated. Just for a second, but long enough that she saw it. That hesitation told her everything she needed to know about who her father really was. Bryn understood immediately. The greatest tragedy wasn't that Thorne had been wrong. It was that his error was infecting the next generation, teaching his daughter to limit herself before she'd even begun. We all carry our failures, Master Sergeant. The question isn't whether we've made mistakes. It's whether we learn from them, whether we let them change us into something better. Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out his personal Force Recon Challenge coin, the brass one from years of carrying, engraved with the insignia that marked him as member of Elite Brotherhood. He set it on the work table between them with deliberate precision. For Captain Donovan, for the lesson you taught without needing to prove anything, for making me better than I thought I could be. Bryn picked up the coin, felt its weight, understood its significance. Challenge coins were more than metal. They were markers of respect, acknowledgement of shared understanding, promises made physical. She reached into her own pocket and pulled out Donovan's coin, the one she carried every day, and placed it beside Thorne's. Keep them both. When Lydia asks you about service, about what it means to be a warrior, tell her about today. Tell her that strength comes in forms we don't always recognize, that capability matters more than comfortable assumptions, that the hardest thing a leader does is admit they were wrong. Thorne picked up both coins, held them in hands that had learned to stop shaking from anger and started shaking from understanding. Thank you, Lieutenant, for everything you didn't have to do. After he left, Bryn stood alone in the warehouse surrounded by equipment that would be used to forge the next generation of warriors. Her left hand trembled with the nerve damage that would never heal, and she traced the dragon balance tattoo through her shirt, feeling the coordinates that marked where she'd learned the price of service. Tomorrow, the graduation ceremony would be public acknowledgement of transformation. But tonight, she'd witnessed the private moment that mattered more, the instant when a father decided to give his daughter truth instead of limitation. The final scene of this chapter played out after the graduation ceremony, when families had departed and the base had settled into the quiet rhythm of a Saturday afternoon. Colonel Whitaker found Bryn standing alone by the Pacific Ocean, watching waves crash against the shore with the eternal rhythm that had witnessed countless warriors prepare for countless battles. Next class arrives Monday, Whitaker said without preamble. 6 more Marines who specifically requested you as their instructor after reading Thorne's report. Word spreads in the special operations community. Bryn nodded unsurprised. Success bred attention, and her success had been too public to ignore. Captain Harrison wants you back in Virginia. Says SEAL Team 4 has an opening. says you've done your time in instruction and earned the right to return to operational status. It was the offer she'd once dreamed of, return to the teams, back to the work, that had defined her identity before Kandahar. But that dream had died in a helicopter. Watching Captain Donovan bleed out had been replaced by something more important. With respect, sir, I have a promise to keep. Captain Donovan didn't ask me to be the best operator. He asked me to make them better than us. I'm not finished with that mission. Whitaker studied her for a long moment, the understanding of a man who'd made similar choices in his own career. Your father called me last night, wanted to know how you were handling everything. I told him you'd exceeded every expectation, that you'd done something most warriors never accomplish. You changed minds that thought they were closed. What did he say? He said you'd already exceeded his own legacy, that you'd become exactly what he'd hoped but never dared to push you toward. He said the scars that matter most are the ones that teach others how to heal. The wisdom of that statement settled over Bryn like a blessing. Her physical scars, the ones that made her hand tremble and marked her body with the price of service, those scars had become teaching tools. Every tremor was reminder to the Marines she trained that capability wasn't about perfect bodies, but about perfect commitment. There's one more thing, Whitaker continued, and something in his tone made Bryn turn to face him fully. About Monday's arriving class. It includes the first female candidate we've ever had from Marine Corps Special Operations, Lance Corporal from 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion. Bryn felt the significance even before Whitaker spoke the name. Lance Corporal Lydia Thorne. Master Sergeant Thorne recommended her personally. Said if anyone could prepare her for what's ahead, it's you. Said he wanted his daughter to learn from the best warrior he'd ever met. The circle completed itself with geometric precision. She'd transformed the father, and now she would train the daughter. The next generation, learning from lessons paid for in blood, taught by someone who'd survived their own death to deliver them. When does she arrive, sir? Monday 0800. She'll be in your first brief. Whitaker smiled, genuine warmth breaking through his usually stern expression. Thorne said to tell you that Lydia knows the truth now, knows what her father was wrong about, knows what you represent. He said she's nervous but determined, and that whatever you did to him, he wants you to do to her. Make her better than she thought possible. Bryn turned back to the ocean, watching the sun descend toward the horizon in a blaze of orange and gold. Tomorrow was Sunday, a day of rest before the cycle began again. But Monday would bring new challenge, new opportunity to honor the promise made to a dying man in a helicopter over Afghanistan. Monday, Lydia Thorne would walk into her briefing room, and Bryn would see in her eyes the same determination that had driven Bryn to enlist, the same commitment that had carried her through Hell Week twice, the same warrior spirit that transcended gender and expectation and comfortable assumption. The dragon balance tattoo seemed to warm against her skin, coordinates of loss transformed into navigation points for the future. Captain James Donovan had asked her to make them better, and she'd fulfilled that promise with 5 Marines who'd arrived as antagonists and departed as students. Now she would fulfill it again with the daughter of the man who'd tried hardest to break her. Would show Lydia Thorne that her father's transformation hadn't been weakness, but strength, that admitting error was courage, that the warrior path welcomed all who were willing to pay its price. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. Somewhere in that vast Pacific, other warriors were conducting operations that would never be acknowledged. Somewhere in quiet towns across America, young women were making the decision to serve, to test themselves against standards that had once seemed closed to them. And here at Coronado, Lieutenant Bryn Callahan prepared for Monday, for the next cycle, for the continuation of a promise that would never be fully complete, because each generation needed to learn its own lessons, needed to be challenged by its own assumptions, needed to be transformed by warriors who'd already survived transformation. She touched the space where Donovan's challenge coin usually rested, remembering that she'd given it to Thorne to share with his daughter. But the loss felt right, somehow felt like proper distribution of legacy. The coin would remind Lydia that warriors came before her who'd paid prices she'd never have to pay, who'd opened doors she'd never have to break down, who'd proved truth she could simply inherit. Tomorrow was rest, Monday was resurrection. The cycle would continue, the mission would persist, and in training rooms and obstacle courses and kill houses across America, the next generation would be forged by the lessons of the last. For Captain Donovan, who'd asked her to make them better. For Master Chief Callahan, who taught her that principles didn't change even when wars did. For Master Sergeant Thorne, who'd learned that strength came in unexpected forms. For Lydia Thorne and all the daughters who would follow, who would serve in a military that had learned to value capability over comfortable assumption. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and Bryn Callahan turned away from the ocean, turned toward the base, where Monday's challenges waited. Her left hand trembled with nerve damage that would never heal, trembled with the memory of 17 minutes, trembled with the promise of better days ahead. She'd been called princess. She'd been mocked and undermined and challenged at every turn. And she'd responded not with anger, but with demonstration, not with argument, but with excellence, not with bitterness, but with transformation. The cycle would begin again on Monday. New warriors to forge new lessons, to teach new assumptions to shatter. And Lieutenant Bryn Callahan, call sign Surgeon, would be ready, would always be ready, because that's what warriors did when they'd already survived their own death. They lived for those who couldn't, taught for those who taught them, and made each new generation better than the last. One evolution at a time, one student at a time, one promise kept to a dying man who'd believed in a future he'd never see. Above Coronado, ancient starlight painted the base in silver. Monday would bring Lydia Thorne, and with her the continuation of a promise made in blood and kept in teaching. The story wasn't ending, it was beginning again. Exactly as Captain Donovan would have wanted.